Welcome to Aspen's Moments of Musical Revelation podcast. I'm your host, James Inverne, and I'm delighted to have with us today the greatly esteemed violinist and teacher, Sylvia Rosenberg. You heard her there playing some Dvorak from the Four Romantic Pieces, Opus 75, and you can hear some more of that at the end of the program. The pianist, incidentally, is Anton Nell, another wonderful Aspen faculty member. Sylvia has long been one of the leading lights of the Aspen School and the festival. She's been an artist faculty member since 1980. Sylvia, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, well, I'm very honored to be here. And I would like to say that I have a long history with Aspen because I used to go there as a student when the streets were not paved and the sheep walked in the streets.
Now you get bears.
That's right, now we get bears.
And I wonder what happened to the sheep. I now have visions of the bears kind of muscling in and the sheep having to move on to the next mountain or something. Before we go to your moment of musical revelation, who was your teacher when you were at Aspen?
Goldberg, and I had studied, of course, with Ivan Galamian, but I went one summer to study with Simon Goldberg, whose artistry I very, very much admired.
Wonderful. And where had you come from? Where were you living at the time?
I think I was living in New York, and I was going to Juilliard, studying with Mr. Galamian.
Gosh. Yes, I should say a quick thank you to Juilliard because they're enabling this conversation and lending their facilities because Sylvia is again in New York, and we're very appreciative.
I have to say a long thank you to Juilliard because if it weren't for Juilliard, I had a scholarship here for like 12 years. I was in what they used to call the prep, and they were wonderful to me. I don't think I would have been able to become a violinist without Juilliard.
Well, a long thank you indeed. And Juilliard and Aspen, of course, as well, have a long association, very close. So, Sylvia, you and I have been talking a bit, and you have got a very interesting story to share. I think it's fascinating. It's unlike any of the other ones we've had, but I also think it's very important. And it revolves around you now in the role as teacher, teaching a lesson to a particular student. And perhaps you can take up the story and tell me what it is you said and what the student said back to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, this is a student who's making a very, very good career, so I won't mention her name, just said her, so you know it's a lady. And she was playing the Stravinsky Violin Concerto extremely well. And there's a place where it says in the music, Piacevole. So I said, very casually, of course you know what that means. And there was dead silence. She said, no, I don't. And I was very depressed by that. Because in my day, and I still have the Oxford Dictionary of Music and Groves and all sorts of things like that, we always had to look it up. These days, young people can Google it and find it in 2 minutes. That she wasn't musically motivated to understand this word and to benefit from the ideas of the composer. If Stravinsky writes Piacevole, he means something. I was a bit depressed by that, I have to say.
And this sort of thing in this day and age is not unusual, is it, amongst students, that they won't know the musical terminology?
They don't so much know the musical terminology, and they find me very annoying because I also want them to become more cultured. If they are playing a piece, for instance, of Prokofiev, they might indeed see a picture of Chagall. I mean, I find that they're not as cultured as they could be. They're not motivated to understand a little bit more, to become more cultured. If they're playing a piece of Prokofiev, they might say, well, who was painting at the same time? Or what books were written by then? I'm playing Tchaikovsky, well, I might read Tolstoy.
And sometimes, of course, I suppose it's also about going to the places if you can. I remember being in China. I haven't told you this yet in our off-air discussions, but I remember once being in Beijing and I had a conversation. I was there doing a feature for Gramophone, who I was working for at the time. And I was doing a feature about the proliferation of classical music and love of classical music in China. And I assembled a little symposium of teachers at the various music conservatories there and also some students. And I'll never forget, this really stuck with me. One of the students said to me, he said, I've been traveling in Europe and I never understood how to play Bach. I never understood what Bach was until I sat in a church in Germany. And then one of his teachers, who his prime had been during the Cultural Revolution when everything was closed up there, he sort of rather sadly said, I've never been able to go to Germany. And so he'd never had that experience. But it was very clear how enriched the student had been from sitting in the sort of place that had inspired Bach.
I'm so happy that you say that, because I had a young friend who's an amateur violinist, and she went on a holiday to Germany. And she went to various churches there. And I said, did you hear Bach? She said, no, I didn't. So I was kind of depressed by that.
Well, of course, not everyone can travel, and not everyone has the budget to travel. But even within America, I mean, at Aspen, although people tend to forget these days, but in the second season, I think it was at Aspen, the great star was one Mr. Stravinsky. And so the great composers, many of them traveled greatly in America. From your experience, can you remember any instances where studying around a composer, studying, as you say, the paintings he or she may have liked, or reading the books that he or she may have been inspired by, or going to the places they may have frequented, has either changed or otherwise just deepened your own interpretation of their music?
Oh, yes. Well, I referred to, for instance, Chagall and Prokofiev, which I think is an interesting thing to consider. But I also think that several books have made a great impression on me. When I first read Anna Karenina, I think I sort of understood Tchaikovsky better. That may sound naive, but I felt more affinity.
Well, I think that these loci, if that's the right word, between different art forms is fascinating. And people too often tend to think that the art form that they love or that they're involved with is hermetically sealed in a box and has nothing to do with any of the others, which of course is piffle. Let's take the aspirational line here, which is that if we turn what we've been saying slightly on its head, and the depression that you had from that moment with that student, you can spin that round and you can say that in today's culture, when the love of the search has sort of disappeared a little bit, since we now type into Google and so forth instead of going to a library, but maybe music itself can be a key to discovering or rediscovering that love of the search. That if you hear some music that you love, even if you're not playing it, you just hear some music that you love, it can perhaps be the first step in a journey that can take you through books, can take you through paintings, can take you through other works of music, and then lead you back to that original piece of music in an enriched way. What do you think?
Oh, I completely agree with you, and thank you so much for bringing that up. And what I would also like very, very much to encourage, so of course we're privileged to have 10 Beethoven sonatas, which go to Opus 96, as you well know. But I think if a violinist were to hear some of the late piano sonatas of Beethoven and the late quartets, it would enrich their understanding of those earlier works, not to mention give them a lot of joy.
Well, that's fascinating, actually, because, of course, Beethoven himself, when he wrote the early sonatas, had no idea. I mean, ambitions, I'm sure, and perhaps determination, but no idea, really, what sort of personal composer he was going to be all those years later. And so isn't it interesting to consider that the composer himself didn't have the benefit that we have of being able to listen to the late sonatas when studying the early sonatas? We have, in that sense, in a way, by listening around, we have more perspective, if that's the word, more kind of perspective than Beethoven himself had at that time when he was writing the early sonatas.
That's a very interesting point. I happen to love playing string quartets, so I play with some of my professional colleagues. We just read this quartets, and recently we played one of the late Beethoven quartets. I think it was 132, where Beethoven is begging the performers, please play in German, which I won't attempt even to speak, begging the performers, play this with the greatest of feeling, please. I think it's so touching. And Beethoven begs the performers to do this.
Well, and then let's extend that point a little bit further at the risk of trying our listeners' patience. But then that makes me think, if we think of Beethoven as one of the first composers who sort of wrote autobiographically, which is often said about him with the Eroica. If we leap forward to a composer like Mahler, who is one might say autobiographical, one might almost say kind of self-obsessed, but certainly his music is very subjective, to do with his own life and his own fears and loves and so on. But I've sometimes heard it said that Mahler is a kind of method actor of a composer, in the sense that the markings that he puts down in the score are meant to be a jumping off point, and the musicians are meant to then add their own passions and their own experience and maybe even neuroses, who knows, to what Mahler has set down. And that's been expressed by Michael Tilson Thomas once, whose parents, of course, were in the Yiddish theatre and came from that kind of Russian method acting tradition. But from what you just say, it seems to me that Beethoven is the antecedent there as well, because if Beethoven was writing in his score that he was begging his musicians to play with more and more passion, that also seems to be a first step towards Mahler and our neurotic age, maybe, or our passionate age. And so there again, by really kind of listening around and going and listening to other composers, you can get the most sort of thrilling perspective. Do you agree with this, from just playing and listening to the one work?
I do agree with it. It's a very complicated question because everything is sort of okay these days, that somehow it has become a little ordinary, which is kind of a pity. I mean, it's okay to half dress or not dress or do this or do that or do the other, so it doesn't become so much of an adventure, which is very difficult, I think, for young people. Everything is kind of okay and is out there. So to make them feel, yes, this is a dissonant chord, to make them feel, no, this is a deceptive cadence. I thought I was going to do 5-1, I did 5-6, to make them still sensitive to these things. It's somehow a little bit of a problem. Everything is out there today.
Right. And knowledge and studying, which is such a dry term, but it really is in itself an adventure. It's a quest.
Well, that's very beautifully put. So if she doesn't care to look up Piacevole, it's okay.
She's not going to go on the quest.
She's not going to go on the quest, and she's not dedicated to having the message from the composer. Yeah. Stravinsky wrote that for something, and it's not such an ordinary word. I don't know another piece where it has Piacevole. Do you?
No, I don't, but I'm far from an expert on that side of things. But no, I don't.
And it's in major. Da-yum, pam-pa-da, it's in Piacevole. And this rather, certainly in those days when the Stravinsky Violin Concerto was first performed, I had the privilege of having some lessons with Samuel Dushkin, to whom it's dedicated, who was, the friend of Stravinsky and played a lot of his music in his early days. And it was wonderful because my teacher, Mr. Galamian, was once ill, and he almost never missed a lesson, but I think he had a kidney problem, and that you could not teach the violin if you had to go to the hospital. So I had some lessons with Dushkin, who I found absolutely fabulous. He's such a cultured person.
I have to ask you, we started with a revelation. Let's see if we can end with another one. Do you remember anything he said to you about playing Stravinsky, which was a revelation of its own kind, something that stayed with you specifically about the interpretation of Stravinsky?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, he encouraged me to play. I have loved Mr. Dushkin. He was a great friend of my teacher, Mr. Galamian. He wasn't the very greatest violinist, but he was a very, very cultured person. And I was impressed by that. It made me want to read more books and see more paintings.
Did he give you any insight, since he was so close to Stravinsky himself? Did he give you any insights, anything that Stravinsky had said to him? I know it was a long time ago and you would be more than forgiven for not recalling, but I have to ask.
No, but my late husband was the director of the Holland Festival and then the Edinburgh Festival. He's a diamond. And he actually met Stravinsky. And it was very, very interesting because Stravinsky, my husband didn't hardly ever drink, wanted him to taste a special vodka. Oh, you have to taste this vodka, which I found rather touching, that he enjoyed many other things in life.
Well, that is wonderful. Okay, well, there we go. Another kind of revelation I asked for and another kind we got, which was Stravinsky's favorite vodka. Sylvia Rosenberg, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you for the privilege. And my hope is that my students, they don't have to listen to me, but that they would become a little bit more conscious, not only of the world around them in the sense of art and painting and books, but also a little bit more conscious humanly, politically, because I think they make a real impression when you think of people like Beethoven who were involved and somebody like Daniel Barenboim. They are part of the world. They want to make the world better.
Sylvia Rosenberg, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
This episode of Moments of Musical Revelation was produced in association with the Strad. Editing was by Tim Burton.